Everybody, this is chapter 10 of Animal Farm. Years passed, the seasons came and went, the short animal lives fled by. A time when there came no one was remembered the old days of the rebellion except for Clover, Benjamin, Moses the raven, and a number of the pigs. Muro was dead, and Bluebell, Jesse, and Pincher, they were all dead too. Jones was dead. He had died in an inebriate's home in another part of the country. And Snowball was forgotten. Boxer was forgotten except for the few who had gone to know him. Clover was an old stout mare now, stiff in the joints with a tendency of rheumy eyes. She was 2 years past the retiring age, but in fact no animal had ever actually retired. The talk of setting aside a corner of the pasture of supernet of knotted animals had long since been dropped. Napoleon was now a mature boar of 24 stone. Square was so fat that he could barely see without difficulty through his eyes. Only old Benjamin was much the same as ever, except for being a little grayer about the muzzle, and since Boxer's death, he became more morose and taciturn than ever. There were many more creatures of the farm now, though the increase was not so great as had been expected in the earlier years. Many animals had been born to whom the rebellion was only a dim tradition, passed on by word of mouth, and others had bought who had never heard mention of such a thing before the arrival. The farm possessed 3 horses now besides Clover. They were fine, upstanding beasts, willing workers, and good comrades, but very, very stupid. None of them proved able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B. They accepted everything that they were told about the rebellion and the principles of animalism, especially from Clover, for whom they had an almost filial respect, but it was doubtful whether they understood very much of it. The farm had been more prosperous now and better organized. It had been enlarged by 2 fields which had been bought from Mr. Pilkington. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a hay elevator of its own, and various new buildings had been added to it. Whymper bought himself a dog cart. The windmill, however, had not been at all been used for generating electrical power. It was used for milling corn and brought in a handsome money profit. The animals were hard at work building yet another windmill when the one was finished. So it was said the dynamos would be installed. But the luxuries of which Snowball had once taught the animals to dream, the stalls of electric light and hot and cold water and 3 work days a week, honestly, nobody even talked about those anymore. Napoleon had denounced such an idea as contrary to the spirit of animalism. The truest happiness, he said, laid in the work and living frugally. Somehow it seemed as though the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer. Except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs, they got more and more richer every day. Perhaps this was partly because there was so many pigs and so many dogs. It was not that these creatures did not work after their fashion. There was, as Squealer had got never tired of explaining, there was endless work in the supervision and organizing of the farm. Much of this work was of a kind that the other animals were too ignorant to understand. For example, Squealer told him that the pigs had to expend enormous labors every day upon mysterious things called files, reports, minutes, and memorandas. There were large sheets of paper which had to be closely covered with writing, and as soon as they were so covered, they were to be burnt in the furnace. This was of the highest importance for the welfare of all the farm, Squealer said at least. But still, neither pigs nor dogs produced any food by their own labor, and there were many of them, and their appetites were always good. As for the others, their lives, so far as they knew, was what it always had been. They were generally hungry, they slept on straw, they drank from pools, they labored in the fields. In the winter, they were troubled by the cold, and in the summer they were troubled by the flies. Sometimes the older ones among them racked their dim memories and tried to determine whether in the earlier days of the rebellion, when Jones's expulsion was still recent, if things had been better or worse than they were now. But honestly, they couldn't remember. There was nothing from which they could compare their present lives. They had nothing to go on except for Squealer's list of figures, which invariably demonstrated that everything was getting better and better. The animals found problems insoluble in any case. They had little time of speculating on how such things now. Only old Benjamin professed to remembering every detail of his long life, and to know that things never had been, nor ever could be, much better or worse, hunger, hardship, and disappointment being, so he said, an unalterable law of life. And yet the animals never gave up hope. More, they never lost, even for instance, their sense of honor and privilege to be members of the animal farm. They were still the only farm in the world, in all of England, owned and operated by animals. Not one of them, not even the youngest, not even the newcomers who had been brought from farms 10 or 20 times bigger. From 10 or 20 miles away, ever ceased to marvel at that. And when they heard the gun booming and saw that green flag fluttering in the masthead, their hearts swelled with imperishable pride, and talk turned towards the old heroic days, the expulsion of Jones, the writing of the Seven Commandments, the great battles in which the human invaders had been defeated. None of the old dreams had been abandoned, of course. The republic of animals which Major had foretold, when the green fields of England should be untrodden by human feet, was still believed in. Some day it was coming. It might not be soon. It might not be within the lifetime of any animal living now, but still one day it would come. Even the tune of Beasts of England was perhaps hummed secretly here and there. At any rate, it was the fact that every animal on the farm at least knew it, though no one would have dared to sing it aloud. It might be that their lives were hard and that not all of their hopes had been fulfilled, but they were conscious that they were not as other animals. If they went hungry, it was not from feeding tyrannical human beings. If they worked hard, at least they worked for themselves. No creature among them ever went upon two legs. No creature called any other master. All animals were equal. One day in early summer, Squealer ordered the sheep to follow him and led them to a piece of waste ground on the other end of the farm, which had been overgrown with birch saplings. The sheep spent the whole day there browsing at the leaves under Squealer's supervision. In the evening, he returned to the farmhouse himself, but as it was warm weather, he told the sheep to stay there where they were. It ended by their remaining there for a whole week, during which time the other animals saw nothing of them. Squealer was with them for the greater part of every day. He was, he said, teaching them to sing a new song, for which privacy was needed. It was just after the sheep returned, on a pleasant evening, when the animals had finished work and were making their way back to the farm buildings, that the terrified neighing of a horse sounded in the yard. Startled, the animals stopped in their tracks. It was Clover's voice. Then they saw what Clover had seen. It was a pig at this moment who was walking on hind legs. Oh my goodness, it was Squealer! A little awkwardly he was walking at first, as though not quite used to supporting his considerable bulk in that position. But with perfect balance, he was strolling across the yard. And a moment later, out from the door of the farmhouse came a long file of pigs who were all walking on their hind legs. Some did it better than others. One or two of them even had a trifle unsteady and looked as though they would have liked the support of a stick. But every one of them made his way through the yard successfully, and finally there was a tremendous baying of dogs and a shrill crowing from the black cockerel, and out came Napoleon himself, who majestically was upright, casting haughty glances from side to side, and with his dogs gambolling around him. He carried a whip in his trousers. There was a deadly silence. Amazed, terrified, huddling together, the animals watched the long line of pigs march slowly round the yard. It was as though the world had turned upside down. And then there came a moment when the first shock had worn off, and when, in spite of everything, in spite of their terror of the dogs and the habit developed through the long years of never complaining, never criticizing, no matter what happened, they might have uttered some word of protest. But just at that moment, as though in signal, all the sheep burst into a tremendous bleating of, 4 legs good, 2 legs better, 4 legs good, 2 legs better, 4 legs good, 2 legs better. It went on like that for 5 minutes without stopping. And by the time the sheep had quieted down, the chance to utter any protest passed, and the pigs had marched back into their farmhouse. Benjamin felt a noise nuzzling at his shoulder. He looked around, and it was Clover. Her eyes looked dimmer than ever. Without saying anything, she shrugged gently at his mane and led him down to the end of the big barn where the 7 Commandments were written. For a minute or two, they just stood gazing at the tarred wall with a white lettering. "My sight is failing," she said finally. "Even when I was young, I could not have read what was written there. But it appears to me that the wall looks different. Are there even 7 commandments? Are they the same as they used to be, Benjamin?" For once, Benjamin considered to break his rule, and he read out to her what was written on the wall. There was nothing there that except for one commandment, and it ran, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." After that, it did not seem strange when the next day the pigs who were supervising the work of the farm all carried whips in their trotters. It also did not seem strange to learn that the pigs had bought themselves a wireless set, were arranging to install a telephone, and had taken out a subscription to John Bull Titbits and the Daily Mirror. It also did not seem strange when Napoleon was strolling in the farmhouse garden with a pipe in his mouth. No, not even with the pipe took Mrs. Jones's clothes out of the wardrobe and put them on. Napoleon himself appeared in a black coat, rat catcher breeches, and a leather leggings, from which his favorite sew appeared in the water silk dress which Mrs. Jones had been used to wear on Sundays. And a week later, in the afternoon, a number of the dog carts drove up to the farm. A deputation of neighboring farmers had been invited to make a tour of the inspection. They were all shown over the farm and expressed great admiration for everything they saw, especially the windmill. The animals were weeding the turnip field. They worked diligently, hardly raising their faces from the ground and not knowing whether to be more frightened by the pigs or the human visitors. That evening there came loud laughter, bursts of singing, and all came from the farmhouse. Suddenly, at the sound of the mingled voices, the animals were stricken with curiosity. What could be happening there now? For the first time, animals and human beings were meeting on terms of equality. With one accord, they began to creep as quietly as they could to look into the farmhouse. At the gate they paused, half frightened to go, but Clover led the way. They tiptoed up to the house, and such animals were as tall enough, peered into the dining room window. There, round the long table, sat a dozen farmers and half a dozen more eminent pigs. Napoleon himself was occupying the seat of honor on the head of the table. The pigs appeared completely at ease in their chairs. The company had been enjoying a game of cards, but had broken off for the moment, evidently in order to drink a toast. A large jug was circulating around the room. No one noticed the wondering faces of the animals that were gazing in the window, though. Mr. Pilkington of Foxwood stood up, his mug in his hand, and in a moment he said he would ask for the present company to drink a toast. But before doing so, there were a few words that he felt incumbent upon him to say. It was a source of great satisfaction to him, he said, and he was sure, too, to all present, to feel that after a long period of time, that trust and trust and misunderstanding, that all now had to end. There had been a time, not that he or any of the present company had shared such sentiments, but there had been a time when the respected proprietors of Animal Farm had been regarded, he would not say with hostility, but perhaps with a certain measure of misgiving by the human neighbors. Unfortunate incidents had occurred, mistaken ideas had been current. It had been felt somehow abnormal and was liable to have an unsettling effect on his neighborhood. Too many farmers had assumed, without due inquiry, that such a farm of spirit of license and discipline would prevail. They had been nervous about the effects upon their own animals, or even upon their human employers. But not all such doubts had now been dispelled. Today, he and his friends had visited the animal farm and inspected every inch of it with their own eyes, and what did they find? Not only the most up-to-date methods, but a discipline and an order lines which should be an example for all farmers everywhere. He believed that he was right in saying that the lower animals in the animal farm did more work and received less food than any animals in the country. Indeed, he and his fellow visitors today had observed many features which they intended to introduce to their own farms immediately. He ended his remarks, he said, by emphasizing once again the friendly feeling that subsisted and ought to subsist between Animal Farm and all its neighbors. Between pigs, humans, beings, there was no longer any animosity. There was no clash of interest whatsoever. Their struggles and their difficulties were one. Was not the labor problems the same everywhere? Here it became apparent that Mr. Pilkington was about to spring some carefully prepared witticism on the company, but for a moment he was too overcome by amusement to be able to utter it. After much choking, during which his various chins turned purple, he managed to get out. "If you have your lower animals to contend with, we have our lower classes." This bon mot set the table in a roar, and Mr. Pilkington once again congratulated the pigs on the low rations, the long working hours, and the general absence of pampering which he observed at Animal Farm. And now, he said finally, he would ask the company to rise to their feet and make certain that their glasses were full. Gentlemen, I give you a toast to the prosperity and health of Animal Farm." There was an enthusiastic cheering and stamping of feet. Napoleon was so grateful and gratified that he left his place and came around the back to clink his mug against Mr. Pilkington's from emptying it. When the cheering died down, Napoleon, who had remained on his feet, intimated that he too had a few words to say. And like all of Napoleon's speeches, it was short and to the point. He too said he was happy that the period of misunderstanding between humans and pigs was at an end. For a long time there had been rumors circulated that he had reason to think by some malignant enemy that there was something subversive and even revolutionary in the outlook of himself and his colleagues. They had been credited with attempting to stir up rebellion among the animals or neighboring farms. Nothing could be further, though, from the truth. Their sole wish now and in the past was to live at peace and in normal business with all their neighbors. The farm which he had the honor to control, he added, was the cooperative enterprise. The title deeds, which were now in his own possessions, were owned by the pigs all jointly. He did not believe, he said, that any of the old suspicions still lingered. But certain changes have been made recently in the routine of the farm, which should have the effect of promoting confidence still further. Hitherto, the animals of the farm had a rather foolish custom of addressing one another as comrade, but he said this would soon be stopped too. There had also been a very strange custom, whose origins were unknown, on marching every Sunday morning past a boar's skull which was nailed to a post in the garden. This too would be stopped, and the skull had already been buried. His visitors might have observed too that the green flag which flew from the masthead. If they did observe this, they would perhaps have noted that the white hoof and horn which had been previously been marked had now been removed. It would be instead a plain green flag from now onwards. He had only one criticism, he said, to make of Mr. Pilkington's excellent and neighboring speech. Mr. Pilkington referred throughout of Animal Farm. He could not, of course, know, for he, Napoleon, was the only one for the first time announcing it, that the name Animal Farm had now been abolished. Henceforth, the manor would be known as Manor Farm, which he believed was correct and also the original name. "Gentlemen," Napoleon cried, "I give you the same toast as before, but in a different form. Fill your glasses brim, gentlemen. Here is my toast to the prosperity of Manor Farm." There was the same hearty cheering as before, and the mugs were emptied to the dregs. But as the animals outside gazed at the scene, it seemed to them that the strange thing was happening. What suddenly had altered in the faces of the pigs? Clover's old dim eyes flitted from one face to another. Some of them had 5 chins, some 4, and some 3. But what was it that seemed to be melting and changing? Then their applause having come to an end, the company took up their cards and continued the game that there had been interrupted, and the animals crept silently away. But they had not gone 20 yards when they stopped short. An uproar of voices was coming from the farmhouse. They rushed back and looked through the window again. Yes, a violent quarrel was in progress. There was shoutings, bangings on the table, sharp, suspicious glances, furious denials. The source of the trouble appeared to be that Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington had each played an ace of spades simultaneously. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. There was no question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and man to pig, and from man to pig again. But already it was impossible to say who the man was and who the pig was. Folks, that is Animal Farm. Take care, everybody.